1987. The Highs were a really nice elderly couple, but there were a lot of dark twists and turns trying to figure out what happened with this case. What the investigators uncovered was a person so twisted and diabolical that he even started to believe his own lies, and that's what made him even harder to catch.
Even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, y'all dragged right down with me.
He's evil to the core.
It took a cleverly devised phone call ruse to try and get enough evidence on the killer, but would that be enough? I had to go to trial basically relying on the testimony of one pretty unsympathetic witness. How are y'all?
Good, how are you?
Oh my God, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's been too long, you know it?
Too long.
Too much. How are you? Give me a hug.
All right.
I remember this case because it was one of my first introductions to the best guys at HPD Homicide, because it was my first cold case and because the victims were so sweet and innocent. What were the family dynamics back then?
Everything was normal.
Well, I
felt.
recently graduated college
Okay.
and recently got married. So.
And I was
Okay.
in college at the time.
When it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that day when you first hear that something horrible has happened.
I was with my dad at one of the facilities we operate, and we were there working together, and my mother called him and said that nobody's heard from my grandparents.
And he went over there to check on him.
Mm-hmm.
On October 8th, 1987, 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the Houston Police Department receives a phone call from a gentleman named Ken High. He was concerned about his parents. They had not been able to reach him by telephone, and so Ken High had gone around the house, peeking in the windows, and he noticed his mother was laying on the bed, and he was concerned that she may have passed away. And he wanted an officer to come there to perform a welfare check. The officer arrives, he meets Pat and Ken High. The officer notices newspapers on the front of the porch. The door was locked. And so the officer makes the decision that he's going to kick the door in. The officer immediately detects the strong odor of gas, and he observes an elderly male on the floor. Face down, there's a pool of blood around his head. There's an outdoor gas cooker hooked to the dryer gas jet just inside the kitchen. You would not want to use that type of cooker inside the house. The officer immediately turns the gas jet off, and the gas starts dissipating in the residence. And he looks at the body. To him, it's obvious that this person had been dead for several hours. Since it's the High's residence and it's an elderly male on the floor, the initial assumption is that it would be John High. Next, the officer proceeds to the master bedroom. He finds who he believes is Ruth High. There was a book beside her, and one of the pages was folded over as if she fell asleep while reading her book.
My partner and I are sent to the scene. I did the inside work, trying to determine if there's anything indicating foul play. We had to wait on the medical examiner because we're not really allowed to touch the body for further wounds. My partner, who was doing the witness portion, he informed Ken and his wife that his parents were deceased, possibly of gas inhalation.
My dad and my grandparents were very close. He was devastated.
I just couldn't believe that both my grandparents were gone at the exact same time. That just doesn't happen to many people.
So what you have at the scene is the smell of gas. You see a gas cooker hooked up in the kitchen. You see an elderly man, John High, lying on the kitchen floor. You see Ruth lying what appears to be peacefully asleep in her bed. No forced entry and nothing stolen from the house.
It was the officer's belief that John had fallen while messing with the gas cooker, struck his head, knocked himself unconscious, and either died from that wound or gas asphyxiation, and that Ruth High had fallen asleep and that she was overcome by the gas fumes as they moved through the house. It's an accidental death. They wrap it up, and that was it.
This is Grandma and Grandpa on their 50th wedding anniversary.
Wow. They got dressed up a lot.
They got dressed up a lot.
No kidding. Look at that.
My grandmother was a native Houstonian. She was a homemaker.
She loved bridge. She loved her friends, loved to get dressed up for different events.
My grandfather worked for a Gulf Oil Corporation for 49 years. He was a geologist. He enjoyed being outdoors, golfing, fishing.
Oh, how cute. This
With both of us.
That's y'all?
That's both of us, yes.
And Susie, the dog. We had Christmas Eve with our grandparents every year, and now we continue that as well. And that's what keeps them alive for us.
On the 9th of October, I was instructed to travel to the medical examiner's office and meet with Dr. Perungal, who had performed the autopsies. The medical examiner immediately informed us that John died from 6 blunt trauma blows to his head. It created 6 lacerations, 2 to 3 inches in length. This is not a natural or an accidental death. John High had been murdered. After it was determined that John was murdered, we need further investigation because there was no forced entry into the house and there was nothing to indicate that Ruth was murdered. There was a possibility that Ruth High had killed her husband. It could have been a murder-suicide and that she died because of the gas building up in the house. We need to return to the scene to see if we can find any information, any evidence that would be helpful.
I think the key to investigating any murder-suicide is to be methodical, thorough, and make sure you don't overlook any single detail. Finding any forensic evidence becomes top priority.
After the medical examiner's report, going back to a scene, we noticed some things. When someone is struck in the head, you have cast-off blood, and some of that was detected on some spots of the wall. And we found an axe handle behind a curtain in Ruth's bedroom. We think there's a possibility it might be the murder weapon, but we're not sure, so we collected as evidence.
There's a gas jet cooker on the floor. The gas cooker is designed to cook crawdads or shrimp. I went to the refrigerator and checking in the freezer, and I did not find any shrimp. There was a candle that had been lit, but it was out. If it was designed to set the gas off, somebody didn't know that. Natural gas doesn't behave that way. It tends to rise, so a candle would not have affected it.
This makes us think that somebody has planned this. Someone left the gas on in hopes that the house would blow up. And in the process of blowing up, destroy any evidence on the body, and then it's going to burn any other evidence up inside the house.
Murder-suicide was just unbelievable. My grandparents had a wonderful relationship.
Seeing them at their 50th wedding anniversary, knowing them from my childhood, that just was not possible. They loved each other way too much for anything like that to happen.
We suspected double homicide or a capital murder. It was something that we'd have to look into. Something that was unusual was John and Ruth's will were lying on the table in the living room.
John and Ruth High made the beneficiaries of their estate Ken High and his brother Gary High. Their estate was around $300,000 to $500,000. So everybody in the family needs to be questioned. You just can't arrest somebody. We need something.
It was a cold case.
The male, who refuses to identify himself, begins talking about a double murder that happened in '87.
1 day has passed since the deaths of Ruth and John High. The murder investigation that started out as an accident and then turned into a murder-suicide based on what they saw and thought happened. The investigators realized how important it was for them to interview Ruth and John's sons, but the medical examiner called first.
Dr. Perungau called the homicide office. When he looked closer at Ruth, he noticed she had bruising on the inside of her lower lip, consistent with her lower teeth. Then he sees petechiae, small blood vessels that break when you're suffocated or strangled. She was probably smothered with a pillow or some sort of object forcefully against her face, causing the lips to be bruised by the teeth. Ruth High was murdered just like her husband.
With that knowledge, then the investigators needed to go back to the scene because there is no forced entry and the doors are locked and nothing appears to be stolen, and consider the idea that this is going to be somebody committing this murder who's in the world of John and Ruth High. Usually when you're talking about a murder, it's going to come down to one of three different main motives. It's going to be either greed or jealousy or revenge. But it sure feels like money is going to be the main factor here because they're worth some money. The number one priority would be to start talking to family members and very close friends about all the dynamics going on with that family.
Ken High is very successful. He's married, has 2 kids. He's close to his mother and father, but doesn't get to see them real often. He explains that he's not very close with his brother, Gary High. He blames that on their age difference. Ken is 8 years older than Gary.
Uncle Gary, my dad's brother, is the type of person that did not talk much, very reserved, very quiet, not very emotional. You just couldn't break that shell to get to know him.
We learned from Ken High about a guy named Duncan, Chuck Duncan. Chuck was the last person to speak to John and Ruth High. Chuck Duncan is business partner of Gary High, but he's also a lover to Gary.
Chuck was over at my grandparents' house all the time, doing stuff for them, helping them go to the doctors and things like that. He was always be invited to family events. He was pretty much included with anything that Gary would have been invited to.
As the investigation proceeds, we learn that Gary High is in a business called High Tech with 2 other people, Chuck and Robbie Duncan.
Ken felt that the company was not doing real well. They were having financial problems.
Ken opens up and he thinks Gary has been asking his dad for money. We need more information.
On October 9th, Gary, Chuck, and Robbie come into the homicide office and are interviewed.
The 3 men had a very unusual relationship. They were business partners, they were roommates, they were friends, and they were lovers.
We learned Robbie actually has changed his name from his birth name to match the name of Chuck Duncan. The 3 individuals function as a family unit, all live together, with Chuck being the head of the family. It's obvious during the interviews that he has firm control over Robbie and Gary High. Chuck wanted to lead the conversations. Like if you said, what did you do yesterday? And if they go to answer, he said, oh, remember you went to... It's like it's a little bit of a cult leader, you know? He's got such control over them. Chuck explains that he sees John and Ruth High often. He ran errands for them, even took John High to the doctor. The subject of the cooker comes up, and Chuck says that John High wanted to fry some shrimp. So Chuck went out and purchased a cooker and delivered it to the Highs. At the scene, we noticed some wills laying out in the open on a table inside the residence. Chuck alleges that John High and Ruth High wished to change their will and leave their inheritance to Gary. When the subject came up, Gary was surprised. You could tell by the expression on his face that he had never heard that before. I think in Chuck's mind, if he could have John and Ruth change their will, cut their oldest son out, then he would control whatever their inheritance was worth, $500,000.
We started questioning Gary, Chuck, and Robbie about their business to see whether they were having financial problems.
They said the company was doing well. So when we asked them how much money was in the bank, they guessed about $40,000. Bank records indicate something else. It was less than $10,000.
So then we tried to determine where they were when the murders happened. Gary and Robbie were in Seattle, Washington, where they were trying to set up a new business. Chuck was in Houston. He adamantly denied that he had anything to do with a double homicide, and even suggested that a gardener or a yard worker or something like that may be responsible for this.
Chuck Duncan is very smart and manipulative and controlling, and he's quick on his feet to come up with explanations and answers to convince HPD of what happened.
As investigators, Chuck raises the flag for us for a couple of reasons. One, he's the last person that saw John and Ruth High. Two, he is in dire straits financially. But you got to have evidence. You just can't arrest somebody.
When I first went to Special Crimes and they started to bring me all their cold cases, there were a couple that came through where I would read them and I would know who did it, but I didn't think there was enough to charge it. So I would keep the file and I put them in this drawer in my office, and I named the drawer my Waiting on God drawer. Those were the cases where I thought one day something's going to come along from God, from heaven, to make this case get solved. For example, a divorce, somebody getting out of prison, somebody all of a sudden coming forward with new information after so many years can make the case change. You're waiting on God to make it happen. 6 years after the murder of Ruth and John High, the Waiting on God drawer came into play, and God finally made something happen.
In August of 1993, night shift officer working in the desk in the homicide office receives a phone call from a male who refuses to identify himself and begins talking about having knowledge about a double murder that happened in '87. He even names John and Ruth High. And he talks about his knowledge of it. Wants to know what kind of trouble he could be in. The officer, he tape records it. When I'm listening to the tape recording, I recognize his voice. It's Robbie.
Robbie Duncan was the third member of the triangle relationship between him and Chuck and Gary. At some point after the investigation kind of quieted down, Robbie Duncan left the relationship. He talked a lot about how much control Chuck Duncan had over both him and Gary, and how good it felt to get out of that controlling relationship.
After Robbie called the night shift desk, Johnny Moore came to me. He had this cold case that was 6 years old, the murder of John and Ruth High. So myself and Johnny Moore drove out to Kingwood, where Robbie was living. He greeted us, invited us in, was very cordial. And almost like a weight was off of his shoulders because he was cooperating with law enforcement and doing the right thing.
He's willing to talk, but he has concerns. He wanted immunity. And we decided to offer him limited immunity. If he didn't commit the murder, he would not be prosecuted.
Robbie was granted limited immunity, meaning that anything he would testify to under oath couldn't be used against him. It made him feel safer. which helped further the prosecution of the case.
He said during their life together, Chuck would bring up the subject of if the Highs would just die.
According to Robbie, Chuck believed that the Highs were millionaires. So if Gary came into the inheritance from his parents, Chuck would definitely benefit through his relationship with Gary. Robbie admits that Chuck was talking about committing the murders to benefit them financially, but he claims he didn't know when it was going to happen.
One day, on October of 1987, Robbie and Gary decide to go to Seattle to see if it was good to move their company there. Chuck Duncan calls up to Seattle. Chuck tells Robbie, I did it, it's over. John fought like hell, and Ruth went peacefully.
Then Robbie said, talk to Gary, handed the phone to Gary. Gary has a blank, sharp stare, not speaking much. There wasn't a sense of excitement that they're finally dead or that there was trepidation that they were going to get caught. It was more of a realization that the murders had been carried out.
During my 16 years in homicide, I've come across a lot of killers. Chuck Duncan is evil to the core. You know, they were friends with him. He doted over them, but he doted over them with a sick purpose to worm his way into their money. I mean, he had to plan this. This is his cold-blooded murder.
Knowing about a crime after it's been committed, knowing who did it and knowing what happened, but yet not reporting it to the police does not make Robbie guilty of a crime in Texas. And so choosing not to come forward to tell on Chuck doesn't make them guilty of anything. Makes a jury not like them, doesn't make them guilty.
There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints or video recordings or anything of the crime. And so we formulated a plan on how to get incriminating information and build a stronger case against Chuck.
Let's see if we can get Robbie to make a phone call to Gary High and Chuck Duncan, and hopefully get Chuck Duncan to make some sort of admission.
If you have someone, a civilian like Robbie, acting on behalf of the police, that might not be allowed if you're calling somebody who's locked up in prison behind bars. You got to remember, Duncan is in the free world. The same rules don't apply. That's why this is not entrapment.
There's always a danger to tipping off the suspect in the case when you have someone who is not an actor play this role. Chuck answered the phone. They started talking, and I'm standing there writing notes to Robbie on what to say.
Is Gary still living with you?
He had a lot of trouble after the situation. Gary went into a deep, deep tailspin.
And then Robbie said, there's a private investigator who's looking into this matter. He's going to ask questions. What should I say?
I don't know if he's going to ask, you know.
Don't. You don't have to answer anything.
Robbie's trying to be really good about how he handles him. But when he says, I wished you wouldn't have done that, Chuck says, I didn't do nothing. I'm not guilty of anything. But somewhere a long ways down in there, he indicates that he did it for the family unit.
We've gone through it. It's over with. It's behind us. And even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, do you think you and Gary wouldn't be unscathed by it? I mean, y'all be dragged right down with me.
The most incriminating thing that Chuck said was, law enforcement has no evidence. Just stick with the story. You got to be strong, because if I go down and confess, then everybody goes down.
Well, yeah, you know, that's why.
I won't allow that to happen. I won't.
He was threatening that they could all be implicated. And that was essentially making a tacit admission that he was involved in the murder of John and Ruth High.
I remember listening to those tapes, listening for that juicy slip-up that Chuck Duncan made. There's not one. There's more little subtle innuendos, things that you wouldn't say if you were completely innocent. But the context of these tape-recorded conversations, along with the financial incentive with Ruth and John's inheritance, the fact that the company was really crumbling and not doing financially well at all, you have your motive. The fact that Chuck Duncan was the last person to see them alive, and that along with all the other circumstances about how the house was left that day, that's enough to move the case forward.
We then secured an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan for capital murder.
After getting our recordings of the telephone conversations between Chuck, Gary, and Robbie, we obtained an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan. Sergeant Belk and I flew to Seattle, where Gary and Chuck are now living.
We met with a fugitive task force. I approached the front door with a couple of police officers, and they banged on the door. There was a long delay. They kept banging on the door, and then eventually looked up on the second floor, and a white male looked out the blinds at us.
Eventually, Chuck came to the door, and he was told he was under arrest for murder.
There was not much reaction from Chuck Duncan when we took him into custody.
Gary Hise and Chuck Duncan. Our information was that they were living together, so it was not a surprise that he was there.
My goal was to try and talk to Gary while the tension was high and see if I could get him to cooperate. Gary asked, "Am I under arrest?" And I said, "No, you're not under arrest." He said, "Well, if I'm not under arrest and you don't have a search warrant, then y'all need to leave the townhome." I mean, Gary's parents were murdered, and he refused to cooperate, refused to talk to us, ordered us out of the house.
We have nothing whatsoever to indicate that he helped plan it. And we know he didn't participate in it. So he gets to walk.
When your dad realized that his own brother could be involved, can you talk about how that affected your dad?
Never have seen him so sad in all my life.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think he just felt so deceived and so, you know, how could this happen?
I think I'd be mad too, mad and sad, and just want to scream at your brother.
It was more about Chuck.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? What do you think he ended up thinking about it?
Chuck just had control over Gary.
Even before all this, you could tell?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Chuck was taken to a local law enforcement agency and read him his legal warnings. He acknowledged he understood the warnings and waived them and was willing to talk, which was no surprise because he was a talker. I mean, and he thought he could talk his way out of everything.
He thinks he's smarter than you are. So he's trying to figure out what I might have or might not have on him. And so he's really curious.
I told him that Robbie fully cooperated with us and also told him about the phone calls were recorded.
You can see his wheels are turning. Now he's trying to think through the conversation.
Setting up this recorded conversation with Chuck Duncan is kind of like what we do on Cold Justice every case we work. You try to get them to give you a statement, a version of what happened, and then they're locked into it because they've said it. Then if they change that version, that can be pretty damning.
He knew he was in a lot of trouble. And so in typical fashion, Chuck concocted another story.
I didn't do it, but I helped do it. Ruth told me she wanted a mercy killing. She wanted somebody to kill her and her husband because they were old, getting frail, and she didn't want to suffer.
And Ruth was paranoid about that. She says, "I need to be able to rely on you, Chuck." She says, I would do anything in the world for you and Gary and Robbie. but I got to have peace of mind, and if I can find a solution. She says, I don't want to wait until I'm in a wheelchair being given tranquilizers at a nursing home. She says I can't face that. And she said I would rather pick and choose the time of my death. And that's exactly what she said.
According to Chuck, Ruth asked him to find someone to kill her and she would pay for it, kind of like an assisted suicide or whatever. He called it a mercy killing. He says, I wasn't there, so I really don't know what happened. I hired 2 yard guys to go do it. And one guy's name was Oscar, and then he mowed the facility where their business was.
I told the boys, not Rob and Gary, but these Hispanics, that they were old and they wanted to go out peacefully. And this is a sum of money, and the money would be there waiting in the house, and for them to pick it up. And that was how the arrangement was.
We had no other choice but to pursue names of all the yard men. We interviewed them, and we knew it was a bogus story, but you still had to close that door.
In his mind, the fact that he presents it as a mercy killing, he would only do a little bit of time in the prison if he was found guilty.
Chuck is putting himself directly responsible for the deaths of John and Ruth High, but not admitting that he physically killed them. It didn't matter to us. We didn't need the truth. We just needed an admission, and he made an admission.
Chuck Duncan is charged with capital murder in the deaths of John and Ruth High.
This case was actually filed 2 different ways. One is it's a double murder, 2 people were killed, and also it's a murder for remuneration. When a murder is committed over money because of money, you can also file capital murder charges that way. I think that when you listen to every line of every word that came out of Chuck Duncan's mouth, Chuck Duncan did not help himself by talking that day to Billy Belk.
Billy, Sergeant Belk, he's a very good interrogator,
Yeah.
very good interviewer. He's a hostage negotiator. Since I had dealt with Duncan before, I thought Billy would be a good fit.
And it worked.
And it worked.
As we get ready to go to trial, I remember, because I looked at the date, I was 5 months pregnant then.
You were?
With my daughter, who just became a prosecutor a month ago. Isn't that funny? It's been a lifetime, Johnny.
Yes, it has.
But this was my first cold case where it had this twist to it. Mm-hmm. And I think the big thing for me was how much the whole case came down to Robbie. I knew that I had to figure out a way to let Robbie get up on the stand and testify against Chuck Duncan. But the main challenge of trying this case with Robbie is that I didn't know what a jury was going to think about him. I didn't know what a jury of 12 people would think about a grown man being involved in this odd relationship and knowing full well that 2 wonderful people have been murdered and never telling anybody in law enforcement the whole truth for 6 years. How are we going to make sure that the jury understands he's credible? Because if a jury hated him, we were going to lose. One thing I had to deal with the case once y'all passed it on to the DA's office, from the very beginning I was always very stressed about Robbie. When he came forward, thank God he did, but it took 6 years. Was the jury going to hate him? You know, getting the jury ready to understand where he was coming from, and he did the right thing. Even if you think you would have handled it differently, let's see if he's credible.
Right.
He was the foundation and crux of the whole case.
Sure.
I was taught a long time ago as a baby prosecutor, every case has a theme. You take the weakness of your case and you make it your theme. So in this case, the issue with the case was, what are we going to do about Robbie? You have to take that and make it your theme and deal with it head on. He comes kind of tainted, he comes kind of muddy because of the way he came around to finally tell him what he knows. One opening statement, I brought up that Chuck Duncan committed the murder, but in August of 1993, Robbie could no longer live with what he knew, and he called and came forward. And maybe he took too long to get here, and maybe he didn't do it like you, but we are only in this courtroom because that man came forward. And the bottom line here was to make the jury believe him, even if they still didn't like him. My plan was to have Robbie testify last so that by the time he hit the witness stand, HPD, the investigators, would have already explained the rest of the physical evidence and all the other incriminating factors against Chuck Duncan. On the off chance that maybe a couple of jurors might not like Robbie, they still understood the lay of the land and his part to play in all of this.
Kelly Sigler is a rock star. She was excellent in the courtroom before a jury. Very persuasive, methodical in building her case. But the biggest impact that my testimony had was Kelly Sigler playing the confession I had with Chuck Duncan, and in his own words, him explaining that he's ultimately responsible for the deaths because he did a mercy killing.
I told the jury, if this was really a mercy killing, why would you need to hit John High 6 times in the head? So the whole story was just stupid in the first place, and it even ended up being kind of laughable. Like, if the jury's going to buy that, come on, no one's going to believe this story, just to show yet again what a manipulative liar he is. He was too big for his own britches, as my mother used to say. So as much as I could present evidence-wise, it was time to call Robbie Duncan to the stand. Before the trial, he came down to my office and we sat there for hours going over the questions for direct. We practiced it. He knew what he needed to do and say. I tried to play defense lawyer and throw cross-examination questions at him and things that I thought that Connie Williams would pick on him about. Connie Williams was Richard Charles Duncan's lead defense lawyer. He was very well respected. He was very well known, and Duncan was very lucky to get him to be his lawyer. That was the single longest written out prep for a witness of any case I ever had. Because usually you have, like 10 civilian witnesses with a little piece.
Right.
But Robbie was the motive. Without Robbie's information, though, think about it, getting the jury ready to understand that Chuck killed the Highs for their money would be pretty much impossible. Robbie was the relationship and dynamic. Robbie's the one that shed light on Chuck's control over them even after confessing to the murder. He was the last witness. He was almost a whole day. He told the truth, told it like it was, and then Connie Williams cross-examined him. And I remember thinking, pass the witness, okay, here we go. How's this gonna go? And Connie started cross-examining Robbie, thinking as he went on, he's doing okay. You just have to sit there, right? Being cool. He's doing okay. And I thought, ooh, he did all right.
He always came across like he was telling me the truth.
Yeah. Some of it was my prep, but Robbie was pretty good. Every kind of way they could insult him, Connie did a good job of trying to do. Why did it take you this long? Isn't it true that you're mad at them and you're paying them back? Isn't it true you helped? Isn't it true you're involved? He might have gotten a little defensive, but even when he got defensive, his answers made sense. He owned that he should have come clean sooner. He owned that he should have been less of a mouse around Chuck Duncan, that he should have been more of a man and done the right thing. He owned all that. You just have to hope that at the end of the day, that came across as credible to the jury. On May the 25th, 1995, after 6 days in trial, I rested my case against Chuck Duncan. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, but it was a strong case. Now, I remember telling the jury in final argument, you know now what kind of a man he is. And so you go back there and you ask yourself, is this man who sits before you today guilty of capital murder? Because if you don't believe he is, are you going to let him go home with you?
I don't remember Chuck looking very concerned. I think he thought, I'm going to keep getting away with things. It was very hard to see him there, knowing that he was the one that took my grandparents' life.
The jury went out. I think it only took them about 20 minutes, and they came back with a guilty verdict, guilty of capital murder.
After that, Chuck was sentenced to death.
After all this time, John and Ruth got justice.
When the jury came back with the death penalty, I felt happy. I felt vindicated. I was glad for my dad, and I was thinking that my grandparents were in heaven shouting hallelujah.
Whatever you think of him, if it weren't for Robbie, Charles Duncan wouldn't have been executed. It's because of him.
Right.
Because of him.
The whole case.
The whole case.
Right.
And that's not an easy thing to have to let your whole case rest on one person.
It's not.
But that's what happened.
Charles Duncan was executed by lethal injection in 2003.
Chuck's last words was, I'm innocent.
Wow. You think at the last minute, the defendant, the killer, will say they're sorry and admit it, and they never do. I've asked a lot of families after they go through an execution. You know, the first time he got scheduled, I was supposed to come with y'all, and it got reset, because they always do. And then it finally happened in 2003, 8 years later.
There's no comparison of what happened to Chuck to what happened to my grandparents.
Right.
Even though there's not full closure, it is closing a chapter and feeling like there's been justice that's been done, for sure.
I still run into way too many families that never get justice. They're still waiting to get justice. So what would you tell somebody?
Don't give up, have hope, and be there for each other so that you can get through it.
After the trial, Ken High never tried to fight Gary High in court over the will, over the estate. They let him have his share, but they never spoke again. And when he passed away, they didn't go to his funeral. My very first cold case that was a death penalty case was far from easy. This case revolved around the issue of having a not sympathetic witness. And so addressing that head on were the keys to the prosecution of this case. Not what a lot of people think are the problems with a death penalty case, especially today in the age of DNA and forensic evidence, but it boiled down to something that simple. Justice for the High family did not come quickly. It took a lot of years. The waiting on God drawer came into play, and they finally did get justice.